As a church leader, I know it's often the good, the bad, and the ugly of church life, and praying really for a refreshing time for all of us over these next 2 days that we have together. A couple of stories. There was a guy in our church who worked in recruitment. He was a graduate, and he'd been doing really well in his work, and he was due to have a 5-figure bonus for the work he'd done. But the directors were kind of manipulating things and trying not to pay out. And so he had a meeting with these two directors, and they accused him of really not caring about the company, just being in it for his own good, his own gain. But he was persistent. He said, look, you owe me this bonus, you need to pay out. And so with some kind of hesitation, they brought out the checkbook, wrote down the 5-figure, and slid it across the table. He took it and he said, thank you very much. And just as they were walking out of the room, he said, hey, hang on a sec, guys. There's one more thing I want to say. And they said, yeah, I'd like to give a donation to this company because I believe in it and I'm for it. And he stood up for justice in that place. For us as a local church, moving into a new neighborhood, we were aware of all the amazing things going on in that community in terms of community engagement. And so rather than kind of just be the new kid on the block, we decided to invite everyone round from local organizations, give out some awards, bring the mayor, give some nice food and stuff, and just celebrate what was already going on in the community. And there was a profound moment when we did this last year. One of the awards we gave to the kind of unsung heroes in the community, we read out her name, and a teary workmate of hers came up to the stage and said, you don't realize this, I've literally just had a message on my phone that she dropped dead this evening. And there was this kind of profound sense of love, of care, of compassion, of God pointing out the good that was going on in our community already. Those stories, they paint a picture of the theme that we have for this conference that was so superbly brought in that creative reading at the beginning. In, but not of. In, but not of. And I hope you agree that we want to build churches that in many ways adapt to, fit in, and find a home in the culture that they are in. But we also want to build churches that are in many ways confronting the culture that they are in. I hope you agree that we want to build churches that if they were to disappear, their loss would be felt profoundly by their local community. But we also want to build churches that in some fundamental ways challenge the status quo and see people freed from destructive cultural norms. We want churches that are in, but not of this world. Both those things are vital. And so as we explore this topic over the next 2 days, we thought it helpful to give a quick biblical overview of what it means to be in, but not of the world. So I'm going to give that for us in the next 5 or 10 minutes, and then Mark is going to come and unpack the effect that we want to see of being in, but not of the world. So what does in, but not of the world mean from a biblical perspective? We would say that the theme is consistent throughout the whole of the Old Testament. So we see God placing Adam and Eve in a place, giving them a menu of food options and saying, I want you to be in this place, but not of the world, not of the serpent's plans. You're not to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. After the fall, God calls Abraham, if you like, the next Adam, the new beginning, and he calls him to what? Go to a land, a place. But he gives him an identity marker, undergoing circumcision. He wants him to be in this place, but not of it. We then follow the narrative through Isaac and Jacob till we get to Joseph, who we read about being in the palace, but he's very much not of the palace, as he says no to adultery. He's in the prison, but not of the prison, as he interprets dreams. Then the people of God grow in Egypt, and God raises up Moses, who is in Egypt, but he is not of Egypt. His heart identifies more with the people of God, and he chooses to be counted among them rather than enjoy the fleeting pleasures of sin, Hebrews tells us. So he challenges eventually Pharaoh to let God's people go, and the people travel towards the promised land. And we see Joshua sending 2 spies into the land that God has promised them, and there they meet Rahab, a harlot, a Canaanite, who is very much in the world, but actually is not of this world, as she welcomes God's people and protects them and is saved as a result. God's people then take the land. They're among the nations, but they're not to be like other nations. And to some degree, they see the success of this. Remember the Queen of Sheba coming to visit Solomon and being overwhelmed. How is it you can be in this world, but you're not of this world? This is something unique. Then there is the split, the eventual destruction of Israel in the north by Judah, and Israel in the north by the Assyrians, and Judah in the south by the Babylonians. But still we read of this faithful remnant, like Daniel in Babylon, refusing to ignore his Jewish dietary laws, refusing to bow down to the golden image, and refusing to stop praying to God. He is in, but not of. And then after the silence, Jesus steps on to the stage. And we could put this quadrant up that may well help. We might say, in the world. But not of the world. Jesus enters very much in, but not of. The incarnation, he comes and lives among us, called a friend of sinners, tax collectors, and prostitutes. But he is very much not of this world. In fact, the world hates him so much, he is crucified. And the 3 people groups of God's people that Jesus would have interacted with are the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. The Sadducees, we may say, are in the world and of the world. The Sadducees are in the world, but they are of the world. They have a pragmatic approach to political and religious matters, and they have a willingness to cooperate with any means with ruling powers. Jesus said to them, "You are in error because you do not know the scriptures or the power of God." We might say that the Sadducees are accommodators of the culture. Jesus also interacts with the Pharisees, and we may say they are not in the world and they are of the world, if that makes sense. So the Pharisees have failed on both fronts. The Pharisees who care about their social status, who care about recognition. And Jesus says to them, "You have neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness." We might call these Pharisees separatists. And the other people group that Jesus would have interacted with are the Essenes. We read about these from Josephus, And they had a very distinctive way of life, chose to live in secluded communities. They intentionally withdrew from the mainstream. And we would say then that they were, again, big generalizations, but they were not in the world and not of the world, the Essenes. And I guess all of us as church leaders, as those involved in church service, can find ourselves in different points at different times. And it's maybe a reflective practice for you to think about what could be the danger for your church community. But Jesus wants us to follow in his footsteps. He wants us to be in the world, but not of the world. That saying comes from his high priestly prayer in John chapter 17, verse 14, where he says, I do not pray that you should take them out of the world, but that you should keep them from the evil one. They are not of the world, just as I am not of the world. John 17, 14. That's where we get the phrase in, but not of. And so we are the Ekklesia. We are the ones called out. And we're called as followers of Jesus to live in the tension of being in, but not of. And that's what the New Testament teaches us. In Romans 12, verse 2, for example, it will tell us to not be conformed to this world. Yet in 1 Corinthians 10, verse 32, it will encourage us to try to please everyone in everything we do, that people may be saved. Or how about 1 John 2, verse 15, where we're called not to love the world or the things in the world. Yet 1 Corinthians 9, 22, we're called to become all things to all people, that by all means we might save some. Or James 1, verse 27, we're called to keep ourselves unspotted from the world. But 1 Corinthians 5, verse 9, we're called to associate with sexually immoral people of this world. We're called to be in, but not of, expecting and hoping for the return of Jesus, where one day we will no longer feel like pilgrims, no longer feel like aliens, no longer feel like exiles. We can be both in the world and of the world when Jesus returns, because his kingdom will be fully here, and we hasten the day. We hasten the day. Mark.
Okay, so I think we can all agree with what Chris has just brilliantly outlined. But the question is, how? The question is, how does it work out? How does it happen that the church is in but not of? And what does it look like in practice? Well, I want to give you the answer. And if nothing else, this is what I want you to remember. Gradually, then suddenly. Ernest Hemingway, the writer, was once asked, how did you go bankrupt? He said, gradually, then suddenly. How do you become financially independent? How do you write a book? How do you run a marathon? How do you fall in love? Gradually, then suddenly. You see, it's going to take longer than we would like and be harder than we would think. But gradually, then suddenly. You see, there aren't any cheat codes. If we want to see change, if we want to see society transformed, we want to see revival. We want the suddenly, but we struggle with the gradually. We can overestimate what God can do in a day, a week, or a year, and underestimate what God can do in a decade or two. As Eugene Peterson said, it's all about long obedience in the same direction. When we show up as Christians and the church, when we do the right thing, he who began a good work will be faithful to complete it. Gradually, then suddenly. Now, we cannot control the suddenly. That's what God does. But we can control the gradually. That's what we are to do. So we're going to look very briefly at two very quick examples in Scripture. One from the Old Testament, one from the New Testament. Let me ask you a question. I wonder what would be your immediate response if I asked you, how did the deliverance of Israel from Egypt take place? Well, many of you might say Moses. The plagues, the 10 plagues. It just took a few days. Let's go back 80 years to the beginning of Exodus. You see, Pharaoh issued a decree to kill all the baby boys. And some Israelite midwives had a crucial choice to make. Exodus 1, 15 to 17. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Shiphrah and Puah, when you are helping the Hebrew women during childbirth on the delivery stool, if you see that the baby is a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, let her live. The midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live. So the Israelite midwives had a choice: obey the law or obey God. Save the boy's life and risk their own life. The Israelite midwives feared God more than Pharaoh, and they let the boys live, and the Israelites multiplied. What was the cumulative effect of their obedience? 80 years later, Moses, one of those boys, was leading the Israelites through the Red Sea. I love to picture these things. I imagine there was two old ladies at the back, kind of just shuffling their way amongst the rest of the Israelites with massive smiles on their faces. It was Shiphrah and Puah. You see, we think that Moses is the hero of the story. But who delivered the deliverer? Two godly, faithful, courageous women. They were being courageous. They were being in, but not of the world. The impact of their obedience didn't stack up immediately, but over time, it stacked up. Because God sees the unseen. God saw the sacrifice and the bravery of those Israelite midwives. Gradually, then suddenly. And then in the New Testament, I think it's Jesus' shortest parable that he tells in Matthew 13 and verse 33. It's the parable of the yeast or the leaven. He tells us, Matthew 13, 33. Jesus told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed into about 60 pounds of flour until it worked all through the dough. This is a beautiful object lesson to illustrate the kingdom of God. Woman puts the yeast into the flour and it makes risen, leavened bread. But it's a picture, an object lesson of how God works. Three very quick things. Firstly, small beginnings. Yeast is small. Yeast is microscopic in size. You only need a little bit of yeast in the dough to make a difference. Given time, the yeast will spread through the dough and bring about change. Do not despise the day of small beginnings. One or two lives lived to the beat of a different drum can make a huge impact. The impact of 12 disciples, the early church, the largest religion in the world, Christianity, had a small, minuscope start. Secondly, yeast exerts its influence from within. You see, the yeast makes the dough rise from within. God first changes the heart of a person, and that internal change then has external manifestations. Christians who are within a culture, in but not of, can act as agents of change, slowly and gradually transforming culture from within. And thirdly, the yeast works invisibly, yet the effect is evident to all. You see, that the yeast does its job slowly, secretly, silently. But no one can deny its effect when the bread rises, when it comes out of the oven. Gradually, then suddenly. The yeast grows, changes whatever it comes into contact with. It's a beautiful object lesson that Jesus gives us that really speaks into this whole topic of our conference. Small beginnings, working from within, working invisibly, in but not of. Confident and creative local churches that shape the world. I want to challenge you, though, maybe we need a different way of thinking about this. And there's a concept known as cathedral thinking. Let me just unpack that for you for a moment. Cathedral thinking is playing the long game and dreaming big. On August the 13th, 1248, the cornerstone of Cologne Cathedral was laid. Cologne Cathedral, the spires of the tower grew to 515 feet tall. It was the tallest structure in the world until 1884. But do you know how long it took from the beginning of the first cornerstone laying of the construction of Cologne Cathedral to its completion? 632 years. 632 years. That is cathedral thinking, dreaming big and playing the long game. I found this quote by a German poet, and he says this. Just listen to this. It'll come up on the screen. People in olden times had convictions. We moderns only have opinions. And it needs more than a mere opinion to erect a Gothic cathedral. You see, God can do so much with one person of conviction, with one person who will stand upon the promises of God, who will think with cathedral thinking, who will, as it says in Joshua 3 and verse 5, consecrate themselves before the Lord. For tomorrow, the Lord will do wonders amongst us. We're to give to the Lord as individuals, as our churches and our ministries, our time, our talents, and our treasures. And as we do that, He will change the world. How? Gradually, then suddenly. Let me bring this to a close. Hopefully, Chris and myself have opened up the theme of our conference over the next 2 days. I want to give you two thoughts to close. Firstly, we mustn't give up. We mustn't give up, because that is the biggest danger with gradually, then suddenly. Have you ever thought what would have happened if the Israelites had given up on the 6th time going round Jericho? Had enough, bit bored, same walls, same music that the worship team keeps spouting out. What if they had given up on the 6th time? Do not grow weary in doing good, for at the right time you will reap a harvest. Galatians 6 verse 9. How will this happen? Gradually, then suddenly. Look at the Israelite midwives, look at yeast. Look how yeast works. And some of us need to dig a well for the next generation. Some of us need to leave a legacy that others can stand upon and accomplish because of you. And some of us need to invest in discipleship, growing the fruit on other people's trees. I hope you're encouraged. I hope you're inspired. And I hope you're challenged at the very beginning of this conference. I'm going to ask if you would stand, and I'm going to pray for us.